ahead and get started. Before actually introducing Jeremy, whom many of you probably already know, I just want to make a brief sort of announcement about the colloquium planning for next year. Within sometime the next few weeks, we'll be sending out an email asking for nominations for colloquium speakers for next year. So I'm just kind of giving you a heads up about that so you can start thinking in your mind about who you might want to nominate when you see that email. Darko Odik is the chair of our committee, so that email will probably come from him rather than me. But today we have our penultimate colloquium talk for the year, and we've tried for the last several years to include at least one talk on our series that's from somebody amongst our own faculty. And so today we have Jeremy Biesanz, who's agreed to give our colloquium, our internal colloquium for this year. So Jeremy did his PhD at Arizona State University, which is a great place for quantitative psychology, and Jeremy has his feet both within our quantitative psych program and within our personality and social psych program, and I think that's really going to be typified in his talk today. After completing his PhD, he spent some time in a postdoc at UNC, and for those of you who are still keeping track, they're in the Final Four. There, do you care? He then went on to Wisconsin for a few years, no longer in the Final Four. And he joined our department in 2004, I think, if I remember.
Yes. Time flies.
So Jeremy's research, like I said, really sits at the interface of personality, social psychology, and quantitative psychology. In the realm of personality psychology, he's made huge advances to the way we study person perception, and particularly the accuracy of person perception. So his social accuracy model has made a big advance, using the kinds of quantitative techniques that Jeremy's fantastic at pioneering to be able to tease apart different ways in which we can talk about accuracy. And I won't throw away the punchline because I'm guessing you're probably going to talk about some of that today. For his quantitative side, many of us, especially if you're a graduate student in this department, know that Jeremy has great expertise in multi-level modeling and repeated measures and within-person types of analyses. Many of us go to him for questions on those things, and his research seeks to make advances in those areas as well, in research on sort of how to do mediation better, how to do effect size calculation and confidence interval calculation better, and how to kind of estimate sample sizes. So he also has a lot of great ideas that if they're not packed into his talk, maybe he'll be willing to share during Q&A about field-wide conversations that are going on right now about how to improve the quality of our science and our methods. Jeremy won the Raymond B. Cattell Early Career Award for some of his advances in analytical methods. And yeah, I'm just really happy to have him here today to talk about the convergence of all of his interests and expertise in a talk entitled, What Have We Learned from New Analytical Models of Interpersonal Perception? So please join me in welcoming Jeremy.
Thank you. So I have to confess, so you brought up the Tanaka Award. So one of the things that happens when you give the Tanaka Award is that you have to give a very long presentation to the Society for Multivariate Experimental Psychology. You have an hour-long presentation to do the subsequent year after you receive it. Vika, our own Vika, just won the award, and so she's looking forward to this for next year. And that year is a year of panic because you go, what am I going to talk about? What am I going to talk about? Because it is a very distinguished group of individuals. So it was that year of panic which led me to develop the models that I'll be talking about. And so sometimes having your feet put to the fire is a good thing. Not enjoyable at the time, but afterwards you can appreciate it from quite a distance. Anyway, so I'm going to cover a lot of material. I'm going to try to keep this light up front, very light. We're going to get a little more complicated. I'll try to keep you with us and keep us together, and then it'll get a little bit more light at the end. But I'm going to give you a good roadmap of where we're going. There's going to be a lot of material. I've been ambitious. For those of you that have seen my talks in the past, have seen those from my students, rest assured, all of the data are new. You haven't seen this before. I'm going to be talking about things we've been doing over the past 12 years and a lot of work we've done over the last several years and pulling it all together in a series of manuscripts we're sending out, some of which are out now, and others that are coming out in the next couple of months. So there's a lot of new material here that's not been presented anywhere. So we're going to start off with a history very quickly in a very light way about personality, accuracy, and bias, covering 80 years in probably about 4 minutes. Then we're going to talk about componential models, different ways of teasing apart different aspects of personality and interpersonal perception. There are a lot of models here. Some of these are going to go through fairly quickly because once you see the model and you understand it, we can move on. I'm going to do some integration of these and contrast them. And then there's the bottom line question. Are they really necessary? Do we really need to go to this level of complexity? How do we know? What's the evidence? Well, that's the heart of the talk, and obviously I have an answer to that or it wouldn't be here. And the answer is yes. So if you have to take notes and present a summary, here it is. That the process, what I'm talking about here ultimately, as we'll see, is providing a lot of evidence to validate some basic dimensions of personality. That some people are better than others at understanding other people's personalities, and other people are more accurately understood by others. And these two dimensions represent individual differences that ultimately are going to have profound implications. And I'm going to present the evidence why these individual differences exist. How do we know that they exist, and what are the implications of those dimensions? So, history, going way back here, until relatively recently, till the 1980s, there wasn't consensus on basic dimensions of personality. That didn't stop people from looking at and wanting to understand accuracy and personality. Accuracy was one of the major topics in psychology, and the approach was very simple. You compared someone's impressions to a validity measure. You know, my impression of Jane versus what Jane says her personality is like, and then you just look at the distance between them, a Euclidean distance, you square the differences. That was the standard approach that people used. And it's very simple, and it just has face validity. So this approach was rampant for a while until Lee Cronbach published an incredibly influential article on that approach. He said that entire process of simply comparing the distance between an impression and some measure validating that impression is not appropriate. This is what he was actually trying to say. Very simple message, but this is what people heard. I've read his article multiple times. It is wonderful, it's opaque. You read it and you go, there are better things to do with my time. And this is after experience and having a lot more training. I can just imagine what it was like in 1955. If you read Lee Cronbach's article, this must have been your experience. You have a choice in terms of what to do. If you're a brand new assistant professor or a graduate student and you want to get a job, you need to publish papers, which way do you want to go here? Do you want to assess accuracy? And that looks scary, especially after Lee Cronbach. You kind of had the sense, he's saying this is hard and difficult, maybe not possible, and I'm not quite sure, versus, maybe we can instead not study real people. We can study the process of forming accurate impressions. We don't need to worry about basic personality dimensions and if they exist or not. We can just use whatever dimension that we want and hypothetical individuals, scenarios, vignettes, these types of things. Well, you can guess what happened. The focus ended up being on let's study biases and errors and not actual accuracy. Very pragmatic. And then we had Michel and the debate about personality itself. It was arguing that basic personality dimensions, wherever you assess them, whatever they are, correlate weakly with behavioral measures. 0.1, if you do a lot of aggregation, you might get lucky and get 0.3. We won't talk about what effect sizes are in other fields if you actually convert the significance test to effect sizes, but 0.3. This had definite Debbie Downer effect on the study of personality and accuracy. Daryl Bem and Andrea Allen had a very influential and nice paper, had a profound impact on me in graduate school. If personality doesn't strongly predict behavior all the time, well, maybe we can predict some of the people some of the time. That was actually the title of their paper. And so the idea here is maybe we need to identify the circumstances, the individuals, the situations under which we can use personality to predict behavior. If it's not universally predictive strongly, maybe under some circumstances it is, and under what circumstances can we find out what those circumstances are? So this led to a lot of different research. I wrote my comprehensive paper going through this entire field. I was reading it, and it was amazing how much work went into this. And people are coming up with ideas left and right. We'll assess cross-situational consistency. We'll ask people, how consistent is their behavior across different situations? How important is this trait to you? This is very Allportian, going back to Gordon Allport, an idea of cardinal or central traits, the trait that defines who you are as a person. You ask people what that trait is. Maybe that trait predicts behavior. And we can also talk about the relevance and have people do assessments of the relevance, public observability. That links in with the work that Samin Vizier has done with the self-other knowledge asymmetry, her SOCA model. This modal approach, the way people are looking at moderators, was to examine low reliability measures of personality, whatever construct of interest they happen to glean onto, and then use single item self-assessments of this moderator variable. Right. So you can probably guess what the net impact of that line of research was. The results should not have been surprising in retrospect. Nothing replicated, the effects were tiny if they ever existed. It was a barren wasteland. It was very depressing. Then we move to the 1980s, and we start getting some consensus on dimensions of personality. And we start having a framework that we can use to examine impressions and personality. The big 5 dimensions of personality emerged. And there's a lot of evidence behind this framework based upon the lexical hypothesis of personality, that basic core dimensions of personality will get encoded in our natural language. We have overwhelming evidence on the fact that 5 broad structures emerge. You can argue that in certain cultures you might get 6 or 7. There's variation around that, but there's a coalescence around these 5 factors. They emerge from factor analyses, looking at the congruence among different types of items in self-reports across lots of different personality domains, and also was done in informant reports. Some of the interesting work on this has also been to go back historically and look at old data sets that people had analyzed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, wherein you were doing factor analyses by hand and actually doing hand calculations to do these. And in the bottoms of psychology departments, you actually had a physical machine to rotate factor structures. You actually had a physical thing that you used to do rotation, to get the coordinates for how to do transformations. Those things they're not around anymore. Anyway, factor analyses took a long time. People don't really understand. I sometimes mention this in classes, but people don't realize how difficult it was. Doing a single one like that could be an entire year, could be your dissertation. And in retrospect, it turns out most of these, or a number of these, were done incorrectly. Raymond Cattell's 16 personality factors, if you go back and reanalyze the data, well, it turns out there were a number of hand calculation errors that were done in that, and you really do get the 5-factor model back out of that. Go computers. We know that self-other agreement is strong in these dimensions, and we can rule out cognitive biases as an alternative explanation. This is not some construct that's within people's heads. There's some verisimilitude to this. There's some truth underlying this. And we also know that the predictability is very substantial, especially after you do appropriate aggregation. Okay. Important point here is all of this evidence is based upon single source reports. Self-reports from one person or an informant report from one person, and there's no componential model underlying this. There is a very simple measurement model that's underlying all of these approaches, is that any errors or biases here are going to be simple and additive, and that they'll cancel out, and that they're not going to have any impact on the analysis. Keep that in mind because we're going to see evidence that things may not be quite so simple. So now we're up a decade into the 1990s, and David Funder took a step back in his realistic accuracy model paper, which he subsequently turned into a book in 1999, arguing that we need to re-examine, start back and look at accuracy again. We need to reinvigorate this field. One of his critical points is that accuracy and bias are conceptually and empirically can be independent. You can accurately perceive individual differences across other individuals and still be biased, positively or negatively. Any combination of accuracy and bias can coexist. And so our understanding of the existence and magnitude of cognitive biases, of perceptual errors, does not inform us about accuracy if they can be independent. So we need to step back and actually start the programmatic research looking at accuracy to understand accuracy, and this is going to be independent of work on cognitive biases and errors. And it's always good to have a simple visual example so you can see it to understand the difference, positive and negative biases and accuracy, and how it always helps me, at least. So Funder's realistic accuracy model, RAM, is very simple at its heart, and we're going to see this again later, so if you don't need to keep it in your short-term memory. But he's arguing for this process. This is the process through which accurate impressions of someone else has to occur. The target has to make relevant cues about their personality available to others. So the part on the left here is that what the target does, what the person being perceived does, and then if you're going to actually understand someone's personality, you have to detect those cues, and then you have to use them appropriately in forming your impression. So we have a necessary pathway here that has to occur in order for an accurate impression of someone else to be formed. Covered that. And it was a call to action, and I answered a little late, 2 decades later. One of the nice things to think about, because this is something that sometimes comes up in the literature, is the philosophical distinction about accuracy. The word is loaded. And if it has any disconcerting effect on you, you can just do a find and replace accuracy with validity, and everything holds. We're not assessing, well, you can think of not assessing accuracy, we're assessing the validity of someone's impressions. And then you can use all of the framework of construct validation for examining the validity of impressions. Okay, now is the time for some componential models. Stay with me on these. Then we'll get to some data and you'll be happy. Stay with me because there's a reason why we have to go through these, because you have to understand one to understand the other. I'm going to talk about Cronbach's, Kenny, lens models. Let's just do it. But first, why do we have so many models here? There's a classic saying here from Box, but it's so true. So the question here is, models may be approximations to reality, but are they useful? That's the question you always have to keep in the back of your mind. I recently tried to expand this in the context of interpersonal perception to talk about how these different componential models, they're necessary because each one gives different insights in truth in terms of what people are like. At a certain level, I'm going to show you this empirically. I decided not to do the mathematical proof. You can thank me later. Empirically, I'm going to show you how they're broadly equivalent and also that they're incompatible. This is the paradox that we face with using all these different models. You can't just say, which model shall I use, or ask that question, because there isn't a single one that gives you all the truth. You need multiple different models. So this is the problem that we face. We need validity measures. We need some validation measures on targets. And we're going to use those to understand or predict perceptions or judgments from perceivers across a variety of dimensions. So what Cronbach did is he just did what any methodologist in the 1950s does. You get trained in the analysis of variance. You teach people how to do this all by hand. And so that's what he did with this problem conceptually. Here you have judgments and criteria for a single perceiver on 4 targets on 3 different traits. You have your judgments on the left, you have validity measures on the right, and you go ahead and you do your 2x2 analysis of variance. Because by this point, you've done so many experiments, you're doing all of your hand calculations for every analysis, you're quite facile at this. And I'm going to show how you get the different components out of this. But what you do is you do that decomposition. You pull out the main effects for each trait. You pull out the main effects for each person. You pull out the grand mean. And inside the cells, what you have inside the cells here are the residuals, what's left over after you pull out the main effect of the traits and the main effect of the targets. Those residuals, they're the interaction components, they're the residuals. You do this separately for the judgments, and you do it separately then for the validation measures to pull out these 2x2 components. And then you have these components separately for the judgment and the criteria, and then you look at the association between them. This is what Cronbach was arguing that you need to do as opposed to using a simple square distance measure. So you look at the relationship between the 2 constants, you look at the relationship between the trait main effects, between these 2 sets. You look at the perceiver, or the person main effects, and then the residuals, what's left over after you account for the 2 main effects and the grand mean. And David Kenny put this in a very nice figure that I'm borrowing here, that those are the different components that Cronbach was arguing that one should use. And he came up with all these names. Michael Furr renamed this stereotype accuracy to be normative accuracy, so it wouldn't be confused with stereotypes and cognitive biases and pre-existing expectations. Differential accuracy we now refer to as distinctive accuracy. But he came up with good terminology to use for this, and that's what I follow. Now, what did we learn from Cronbach? First, components are important, need to be separated. We now know how to have fun with 2x2 analyses of variance, because that's always fun, isn't it? Right. This approach just died. No one followed it. There are a couple of papers that actually went through the effort of doing this, and I wonder why. It gets cited a lot, but it's never cited as terms of, oh, we're doing this approach. The reason why is it's not useful. It doesn't provide any substantive insight. It doesn't answer any of the questions you might actually have. There's nothing mathematically wrong with it. It's just it's not a model that lends itself to addressing questions of interest. Which is why David Kenny came along and said, okay, let's think back about this and try a different approach. His social relations model is an update of this, but it's not focused on accuracy. It's focused on consensus, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But it follows the same broad logic. It's focused on just one part of that interpersonal perception data box. We're not incorporating the validation measures here. We're just looking at impressions. But as opposed to going across different dimensions like Cronbach did, what we do is we look at the perceiver by target data box for a single trait. So it's a trait level analysis. It's a variable centered analysis. So here we use the single trait. My example here is active, and we have a whole bunch of targets. We have perceivers, and because we have so much fun and we love 2x2 analyses of variance, that's what we do. We do a 2x2 analysis of variance to get main effects out. That's what the heart of the social relations model is pulling out the main effects from a 2x2 ANOVA? What is the average level of active that Jane is perceived? How active does Jane tend to perceive targets? That's her main effect there, the alpha 1. And similarly, beta 1 here is how active Jane is perceived to be on average across the different people that form impressions of her. And the social relations model then estimates variance components, so you get the variance attributable to perceivers, how much variance in impressions broadly is attributable to perceptual biases, you can argue, and how much variance is attributable to target main effects. The variance across the betas here represents consensus, the extent to which people agree on others on how active they are. So they're the average effects there, the main effects. So what have we learned from the social relations model? David Kenney keeps an updated PDF of every paper that ever uses this model, and it's long, so it's been a very productive model. We know that consensus exists across personality dimensions, and this is important. This is one of the critical aspects that helped validate the Big Five. In his 1994 book, he goes through that data and the data he collected to help validate the Big Five. But it's designed to assess nomothetic levels of accuracy, average levels of accuracy. To what extent is there accuracy in general? It does not assess, it's not meant to assess individual differences in this. We also know that there are substantial perceiver effects. Some people have rose-colored glasses, other people have blue-colored glasses. Their perceptual biases are strong, and this variance is always a huge part of any type of social relations model analysis. Sanjay Srivastava has a great paper where he actually goes through and does the social relations model using small items on the Big Five inventory and show that you actually get a Big Five structure on these perceptual perceiver effects. Very interesting, very well done paper. And then we can talk about behavior. It has a lot of utility in dyadic domains. It's often used to do assessments of behavior, and it has different terminology in that context. And people talk about actors and partners. You can do reciprocal effects. You can extend the social relations model to group level analyses as well, and examine group level effects. Okay. The lens model. Roots with Brunswick. The lens model is a way of looking at process. How do we understand how people actually form accurate impressions? Let me work you through the little parts of this because this is going to be needed later. And I'll wake you up later too. So with the lens model, you start here with the validity measures. This is a variable centered, so it has to be on a specific trait. I've chosen sociable here. You gather measures on a whole bunch of different mediators, cues, through which you're examining to what extent do accurate impressions go through these cues. So do the targets, so differences, individual differences on sociability relate to these cues? That's what this path is here, the V's. That's the relationship between individual differences in sociability on the targets on this side as it relates to cues. So people who are more sociable, are they warmer? Are people who are more sociable, do they smile more? That's what these paths are showing you. These paths are the relationship between the cues and perceiver impressions. They're simple correlations. To what extent do people use the warmth that the target is displaying to form their impression of how sociable they are? To what extent do they use how many nods they provide to form their impression of how sociable they are? One of the measures that gets used in the lens model approach is to look at sensitivity. You look at the correlation between this set of the cue validity measures here with this set of the cue utilizations. You correlate those two sets, and that's what the sensitivity is. So to what extent is there discrimination on the validity measure side? Some cues are more or less diagnostic, and are perceivers then using those more diagnostic cues more, and the less diagnostic cues less? That's what the sensitivity correlation tells you. Now the lens model is fantastic. It really, really is. It directly mirrors Funder's realistic accuracy model. It can be extended in interesting ways. There's this group out in Germany with Stefan Nessler, Mitja Bach. Sarah Hirschmuller has a paper several years ago that develops a dual lens model approach where they separate automatic controlled processes and perceptions and show how to use dual processes in a single lens model and integrate that all together. Very elegant, very, very, oh, it's bigly. Its lens model is great if you can do it. You have to have a different model for every different trait. It's a variable-centered approach. Each of the traits and the analyses that you do may have a different set of relevant cues. The cues that you use for openness, how intellectual someone is, may be quite different than the cues that you use that are used when forming impressions of hostility or arrogance. You may not know what those cues are. The relevant cues are up front, but with enough work, these are surmountable obstacles. You might not be able to do it all in a single study, though. It might involve iterative studies, and it's a lot more data collection. Okay, and I still haven't gotten to data. So, variable and person-centered approaches, I'm going to go through this quick because you need to understand this to understand when I get to the social accuracy model. The lens, the social relations model, is variable-centered. Do it separately for each variable. This has been the common approach we've used in validating personality measures. Profile analyses are person-centered. Example, you're examining agreement across traits within a person. You might have 100 traits for Jane, and you're looking at the agreement. Her self-reports on those 100 traits with a close informants reports of her standing on those 100 traits. There's in different guises over the years, there's been different person versus variable-centered approaches have come up in a lot of different ways. In factor analysis, Q versus R, if that strikes any bells with people's memory, it's not something that's in vogue anymore, but it's basically you're factor analyzing persons as opposed to variables. It's the same data matrix. This is the thing that I want you to remember. The data set is the data set and has not changed and doesn't change depending on how you slice it. However you slice it, you can recombine it back together because it's the same data and you should end up with the same answer. So there's nothing different about doing a person-centered or profile-centered approach because you're working with the same data. And I'm going to show you this. However, there's often this intuition that it gives you something different, something privileged, something that you do not get from a variable-centered approach. That intuition, you have to squash it down, put it in a little box, and put it away, and ignore it. I'll show you. Okay. They're broadly equivalent. You get the same answers out. And I'll show you what the level of equivalence is exactly. So instead of algebra, data. And there's a reason why. It's a half-block design, and we have 202 perceivers. They all watch the same set of 7 videotapes. Impressions are 44-item BFI, the Big Five inventory from Oliver John. The validity measure is the target self-report on the BFI. So we have a complete data set. This makes the equivalence mathematically easy to see. And I have the full data set and everything here available on the OSF website. Open data, open materials. So I'm looking at 4 different levels of analysis. I'm looking at self-other agreement here. For the targets, it's a profile analysis. So for each of the targets, aggregating across perceivers, each target then has 44 items. We're looking at self-perceiver agreement. So there's 7 correlations here. We have the variable-centered approach where I do the analysis separately for each of the 44 items on the BFI. I calculate their agreement separately for each perceiver using perceiver as the unit of analysis. And then we're averaging across the 7 targets. And that's a profile analysis. I also do it at the dyadic level, so the 202 times 7 dyads that are in this data set. And this is the box plot of the distribution of correlations that you obtain actually on standardized regression coefficients. And you look at that and you go, that looks different. By the way, this is what Edward Tooft recommends. It's he advocates maximizing the data to ink ratio. So minimize ink, maximize data. So we got the mean, the median right here, the semi-interquartile range is the negative space, and then you see the upper and lower quartiles. This looks like it's getting you different information. And when you actually do the analysis, you stick it in the computer, do a random effects model with the different levels of analysis, you see that the average fixed effect is different for each of these analyses. This is why this keeps on coming up in the literature, that maybe profile analyses are different because you get a different number out when you do this. And the tau is the random effects estimate, the estimate of the standard deviation across those units of analysis. And if you go random effects, you calculate each of your regression coefficients by hand, and then you average them, you get different answers. They're not all the same across the different ways of doing the analysis. Well, the problem here is that you're not weighting things appropriately. You're treating every regression coefficient as being equal and giving equal weight to it, when in fact you need to give more weight to those coefficients that are more precisely estimated. The variance is smaller on the predictor for some of these coefficients and a little bit wider for others. So if you weight by the precision of each of the estimates, the inverse of the variance, the regression coefficient, if you weight them so that they are all given equal weight for the information that they provide, you see that you get exactly the same answer regardless of how you slice or dice the data set. This represents the average relationship across the variables, the average relationship within. Again, I had to emphasize, not a typo. I didn't hit copy, paste, copy, paste. Well, I did, but I meant to, because those numbers are exactly the same, and which is why it carries so many decimal places. So you can see that it's not some sort of rounding thing. They're closest. No, they're exactly the same as they should be when you have a complete data set. A profile analysis, the average effect you get out of it, is exactly the same as the average effect across the variables. That's what you're estimating. I'm going to quickly go through the SAM. I'm not going to spend much time on it so you can get to the interesting part, the data. It's a componential model. It's a profile model. So we're interested here in estimating a slope, estimating a level of accuracy for each perceiver, for each target, for each dyad, so that we could then estimate individual differences. So as opposed to estimating what someone's level of active is, we're estimating someone's level of accuracy. Okay, now it requires lots of data. We have to have lots of perceivers, lots of targets, lots of measures, and put them all into the same analysis. It integrates Funder's realistic accuracy model. We're assessing the validity of impressions. We're following Cronbach's data set, and I'll show you this. So we take his approach, kind of, we adapt it, we borrow it, but then we apply Kenny's social relations model to it. So we're merging all three of these in one hybrid kind of scary thing. So at the core, it's very simple. We have two predictors to predict impressions across a series of traits. What the average level, the mean is for that particular trait, and then how the target is different from other people on that particular trait. It's a two-predictor regression equation, and these coefficients provide us with estimates of distinctive accuracy. To what extent is someone different from other individuals, and to what extent are they similar to what the average person is like? Okay. If you go back to Cronbach's decomposition, these are where the values actually come from. We take the item means as a predictor. We take these uniquenesses and put those in as a predictor, and we're predicting the impressions in a profile level. We do it separately for each dyad. So every single person gets used in this analysis, and we have a lot of regression equations. So this is where the social relations model comes in. We have perceivers and we have targets, but for each perceiver target, for each dyad, we're estimating this two-predictor regression equation. We have two slopes, one for distinctive accuracy and one for normative accuracy. That's what we're doing in this analysis. So we're getting a slope, and I'm going to skip ahead to the big Because this is what we're really doing. We're getting the marginal effects, the main effects. This is Jane's level of perceptive distinctive accuracy. How accurately does she see others on average across the different targets that she forms impressions of? And this here is Jane's expressive distinctive accuracy. How accurately is she understood on average across the different people that form impressions of her? These are the slopes that we're estimating under the social accuracy model. So it's following exactly the logic of the social relations model, but as opposed to single numbers, we're estimating accuracy slopes. And the distinctive accuracy is understanding how you're different from other people. Normative accuracy, for what I'm going to talk about, not going to focus a lot on it today, for the purposes here is generally going to be equivalent to bias, how positively or negatively you view others. So quick design here just to show you why this ends up being useful, why there's actually something here. We have people engaged in a round-robin design. We have 380 people. They all come in. They speed date. Everyone sits down with everyone else individually for 3 minutes. They chat about whatever they want. We separate them. They fill out an impression of what they're like, what their impression of what that person's personality is like, and a small version of the BFI, 24 items. And then we compare those impressions to what that person says they're like, their self-reports, what their close friends say they're like, because we go out and get that information, what their parents say they're like. So we validate the impressions against a broader array of validity measures to actually assess the validity of the impressions. And with this first initial design, we saw that distinctive accuracy on average across everyone, across targets, perceivers, and traits is 0.17, is unstandardized. We see distinctive validity, or first impressions on average across everything are accurate, and normative accuracy is really high. It should be, on average, the average person is seen as similar to the average person. Say that 3 times fast. Okay. What's really interesting here are the random effects, the individual differences. This is showing us that the standard deviation around that 0.17, that there is variability on how accurately people see others. This is showing us the variance on the accuracy with which people are seen. Some people are seen more accurately than others. There's a lot of variability here. And if we move to the normative effect, the biases, some people have strong tinted glasses. Other people are seen positively or they're seen negatively. There's strong individual differences on the normative component as well. Okay, why Sam? I'm going to skip this because I know I'm going to run out of time. We've done a lot of work. We've done experimental manipulations on this. It's really useful. It has a lot of statistical power. Okay. We've done a lot of work on this, but now, why might these be basic individual differences? Are some people really open books and there's something profound about the nature of their personality? This is all new data. We know that there's substantial variability in expressive accuracy, how accurately you're understood. We know that it's related to adjustment, well-being. My dissertation research showed that people who are accurately perceived are stable over time. All of this work we've done so far is on big 5 traits and initial impressions, live interactions. That's what we know about expressive accuracy so far. Does it generalize across domains? Does it generalize across contexts? Do we have any insight here as to any data now to say that this may be a strong individual difference? Oh yeah, we're getting there. I'm going to look at live impressions from round robin, how that compares to impressions you form looking just at social media, Facebook profiles. Round robin impressions, live interactions there, versus writing samples from the same individuals. And we're going to look at big 5 personality traits and motivations and how those relate. Then we're going to look at long-term acquaintances and also behavioral coherence, behavioral measurements through experience sampling studies. So social media, this is quick. People come through that round robin design. They meet each other. They form impressions. We validate those impressions. Then they evaluate the Facebook profiles of the previous session's participants. So the 1 or 2 pages from the basic part of the Facebook profile. They look at those. They provide us with their impressions of the previous session's participants. There's some more complications. It's irrelevant. The levels of distinctive accuracy are about the same if you meet the person versus you see their Facebook profile. But is the good target, the person who is seen accurately in an interaction, are they also seen more accurately on online social media? And the answer is yes. This is showing you the relationship between how accurately what you're perceived on average in an interaction and how accurately you tend to be perceived from your Facebook profile. Correlates 0.45, really strong, but we know things never replicate, except for sometimes. We did the study again and found exactly the same effect. It's a very strong relationship. I'm flabbergasted. People who are open books, when you meet them, are also open books online. They're giving you windows into their soul in both contexts. Okay. Then we decided to get crazy. I should say, qualify that. We expanded our design dramatically. And let me just walk through this. We have our basic round-robin design. Everyone meets everyone else, gives us their impressions from live interactions. 200 participants in this. We have our 24 items from the Big Five inventory, but we also added 20 items from Schronbrott's unified universal motive scale. He developed this several years ago to assess, doing factor analyses of different motivation scales. And so it assesses power, achievement, affiliation, intimacy, and fear. We put that on. We have validation measures, self-reports, peer, and parental reports for both traits and motives that we're using to assess the validity of impressions. As if that's not enough, we then had people write essays. They had to sit for half an hour. They wrote longhand essays on 5 topics about their hobbies, family, academic studies, and plans for the futures. We're following the essay stems that Peter Borkenau just published last year. I got a preprint of his paper and I said, oh, that's a brilliant idea. We're putting that on. So we have those essays. It's 2 pages total that they provide. We typed them in, and then we brought in a new set of participants to read those essays and provide us their impressions of those people's personalities and their motives. So we ultimately, if you take the big step back, which I didn't at the time, but I probably should have, we have a 2x2 mixed design here with information, live interaction versus reading essays versus domain, traits and motives. So I'm not going to give you the 2x2 analysis of variance. I'm giving you each of the cell effects here in this table. We see that the levels of distinctive accuracy, which is what I'm going to focus on, is, you form accurate impressions of people's motives, just the same as you do with Big Five traits, both live and from reading essays that they write about themselves. You also see that distinctive accuracy, the variability with which people are perceived by others, that variance is real in each of these domains and contexts. And they correlate with each other, with one exception. But there are strong relationships across these domains and contexts. So if you meet the person live, the accuracy of your impressions of their traits correlates 0.5 with your accuracy of your impression of their motives. And in fact, the traits across both live and writing, substantial. I'm amazed at this. Except for that your impressions of the traits doesn't correlate with their writing of the motives, but everything else is, wow, there. And I'm just going to go through these quickly, just to show you what these look like visually. Strong associations, good sample size. We're setting up to replicate this. We see the same thing with positive biases, but it's a little bit more muted with the exception down here where if you like the person in the writing sample, you just like them. There's not much, that's a real strong association. Okay. So, step back. Is this limited only to initial impressions? Is this something that only manifests itself when you first meet someone, forming an initial impression just a couple of seconds, couple minutes? No. People who are better targets, more expressively accurate within the context of the round-robin design, there's higher levels of long-term informant agreement for these individuals. Correlation of 0.34, massive sample size, 421. We also see a positive association. If you're someone who's expressive and open when you meet someone for the first time in our study, your friends and parents agree with each other more on the nature of your personality. It's easier for them to read you. And they've known you a while. Last one on the good target, is this something really about behavior and how you express it and coherence, congruency in your behavior across time? We took 200 people that came through a round-robin design and put them through an experience sampling study. Assessed them 5 times a day for 2 weeks. Each assessment, when we randomly texted them, hey, fill it out now, we had them describe their personality using the same items that we used within a round-robin design. And we see here, and we're looking here at the pattern of behavior across time and how that relates to how they're perceived and how accurately they're perceived within the round robin. Are the people that are more coherent, more consistent in their behavior across time also the ones that are good targets, expressively accurate? And we see that there's a correlation here as well. So good targets are the people that are seen by their friends more accurately, and there's also congruence behaviorally. So expressive accuracy, the good target, across domains, it's across contexts. So we're seeing evidence in lots of ways that this is a basic fundamental individual difference, and it's related to coherence. It's not just initial impressions. Okay, good judge. I'm only a third of the way through. And I'm joking. This is faster. Long time historic focus on the good judge, dismal assessments, little memes. I'm coming back to the memes, don't worry. More recent assessments were optimistic. There's more evidence recently that things may be quite good, and some people might be better than others in understanding other people. And we see that this variance exists in the social accuracy model, but it's small, very small relative to the good target. Recent work with Doug Coleman, who came up and was working with me for a couple of months. We got a paper out of this, so data that he collected, I helped him analyze it, showed in 4 studies that empathic accuracy, Mark Davis's measure of empathy, shows that people that are more empathic, have higher levels of empathic concern, form more accurate impressions of others. It's a correlation, it's not a direct assessment of the individual differences, but it's consistent with what's been hypothesized previously and not shown before. People have been failing to find this effect. We had 4 large samples to show it cleanly and clearly across these 4 samples. All the studies showed this basic result here. Okay, now it's back to funder. And I'm going to make an argument for why the good judge has been hard to find. It's because we've been doing it wrong. And we haven't been thinking theoretically. So this is work I've been doing with Kate Rogers. And here is the argument. Let me go a step back to funder. There's nothing wrong with this model. This model has to be true. Good targets provide relevant cues, make them available, which then judges detect and utilize. Now, we know that there's variance here. Some people are good at providing relevant and available cues, and other people are not so good. There's a large amount of variance there. So, if some people are open books, they're going to be easy to read, and the good judge should be able to read them well. But if other people are closed books, it doesn't matter how well you're able to read if the book is closed, right? That's what this is showing. If someone's low in expressive accuracy, they don't provide you relevant cues and make them available, it doesn't matter how good of a judge you are, how perceptive you are, you have nothing to work with. Garbage in, garbage out. But if the target is expressive, they provide lots of relevant available cues, then the good judge should matter in that context. Of course, if funder is completely wrong, it's been spending too much time in the sun in California, then it's just a couple of main effects, and that's all you'd ever find. So we brought in 4 incredibly large samples to bear on this. Sample sizes of 500 perceivers, 350, over 1,000, over 1,000, lots of data. Samples 3 and 4 are video perception studies where you're watching tapes of individuals. Here's just showing you that there's variance in the good judge, there's variance in the good target. Now let's put those together to study whether the good judge matters more. Does the good judge form more accurate impression when evaluating a good target? In other words, is there an interaction between the good judge and the good target to predict the accuracy of impressions within a dyad? And the answer is, oh yes, there is. Across all of these studies, we have absolutely the same pattern of interactions. It is profound. This is all really dry until you see this. This is what we find. This is one of the studies. They're all exactly like this. So if there's a poor target that's 2 standard deviations below the mean, this beta weight is 0. At the average level, for the average person, you have a beta of 0.3, the moderate correlation. This beta up here is 0.6. So if you have the ability of a good judge, individual differences in the good judge correlate 0.6 with the accuracy of their impressions when they're forming an impression of a very good target. It's incredible moderators. In other words, we've been averaging across the good target in all of this for the past 100 years without realizing that that's a profound individual difference that we need to take into account. This is all on distinctive accuracy. Normative accuracy shows a very different pattern. Nothing. Which makes sense. If you're someone that everyone loves and forms a nice impression of, everyone agrees that you're a great person, and you're also someone that forms positive impressions of people in general, you don't form a more positive impression because the person is a nice person. It's not a multiplicative effect, it's just an additive effect. This is what we find across all of our data sets. And yes, we have power. Okay. Last one, because this is fun. Can we merge the social accuracy model with the lens model? This is stuff I've been working on the last month, and it is really exciting. I've had conversations with Dmitry Bach about this years ago, and for an entire year I was like, nope, can't be done. Nope, can't be done. No, it can't be done. I'm not so sure now. I think it can be done. Some caveats, I'm going to show you how. There are some limitations to do this. And you should be skeptical. But it can be done. Social accuracy models average levels of expressiveness and perceptiveness. Across the different trait dimensions, lens models are done separately for each trait. But if the good judge and the good target are real individual differences that are broad and across domains, across traits, then assessments of those individual differences moderate each of the pathways of the lens model. I need to show you. But first, let me explain the data, because I have a lot of data to show you. This is work that Kate Rogers did for her dissertation that I'm adapting to this. So we had a large number of people come through a round robin. We taped randomly, selected 2 people out of the round robin, taped all their interactions. So we have videotapes of people from a round robin design. Then we had people go in and watch those tapes. We had used those before in some of the data I was just showing you on the good judge. We have our RAs go in and rate all of those videotapes for behaviors using the Riverside behavioral Q-sort. They didn't do the Q-sort, they did Likert-style radius. So they loved us. This took, between the videotapes and the RA coding, is about a year and a half. That's a lot of data. But we have a lot of data. So, yeah, you have no idea. Bear with me, we can do this. We'll start with the lens model, extraversion. Here are a couple of the items off the RBQ, the behavioral Q-sort, that we had the RAs assess. And so this pathway here is the relationship between the target's level of extroversion and this cue as rated by the RA. So more extroverted individuals appear more relaxed and comfortable. They also have more charisma or charm. And in turn, the perceivers, these are all betas or correlations. In turn, the perceivers are using these cues to form their impressions of extroversion. All of these measures are based upon the full BFI, 44-item BFI. So we have 8 or 9 measures or items for extroversion here. Okay, and the average sensitivity here for extroversion is 0.84, so perceivers are using the more relevant cues and forming their impressions. It's all good. Now, the good target, the measure of distinctive expressive accuracy, should moderate those paths. If you're a good target, you're going to make those cues those relevant and available cues more frequently available. This should be a stronger pathway for the good target. At the same time, the good judge should have a stronger pathway here. Our measure of the good judge from the social accuracy model should moderate this pathway right here.
Jeremy, I would have thought it moderated sensitivity.
It does too. Because if you change those paths, it changes sensitivity. Yep. I'm always have the average sensitivity down here, which is at the average target, average perceiver. But that number does change depending on how you change good target, good perceiver, absolutely. Now, this is as complicated, and there's a special hell for me for making this slide. You should never have something this busy, but I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to put all 79 items on, but there's a lot of data, and all these analyses represent 79 items, the full set of everything. Okay, so the blue is the levels of moderation, the moderator effect, and these are all standardized. We have 79 items, and I'm saying right here, 36 of those 79 items are significant at the average. This is the main effect. And these are how many of the 79 interactions are significant for the good target. And this is how many of the relationships are significant for the good, on average, at the average level, the average perceiver, and how many are moderated by the good judge. I need to say there's 77 targets involved in this analysis here, and we have 1,000 perceivers over here. So that changes. And when you're looking at this pathway here, you're averaging each of those targets across their different interactions. And here, this is each dyadic impression. Each perceiver only saw each target once. We had a planned missing design. Anyway, this correlation here says that if the Q is higher, how does this number here correlate with the interaction effect? It's a measure of the interaction sensitivity. This is telling us that for cues that are more valid, the good judge measure is strongly correlated with that. The interaction effect goes up, gets higher. And we're seeing over here that if that cue is more relevant, the good judge interaction goes up as well. In other words, the average effect here is correlated with the interaction effect. This is extraversion. So we're seeing here, boom, across the board, that the good target strongly moderates this effect, and the good judge strongly moderates these pathways here. For agreeableness, we got kind of bupkis over here. There's not much going on. We have average sensitivities, great here, but we're not finding many significant effects. The effects are not strong here. Perceivers are using this information like crazy, and the good judges are using more relevant information better. For conscientiousness, not so much on the target side anymore. Our sensitivity is only 0.32, but the perceivers are able to extract information out here. For neuroticism, things get a little weird. There's a negative association here with the good target. I haven't wrapped my head around that. If anyone has ideas, please let me know. But perceivers are strongly pulling information out from the Riverside behavioral cue sort. Go back to openness, very similar to extraversion. There's lots of relevant cues here and strong interactions on the good target side. And again, the perceivers, it's all over here. but we have so much power on the perceiver side, we have less power on the target side. And sensitivity, average sensitivity is really high at 0.7. So this is what we're finding. Distinctive and expressive perceptive accuracy, they're strongly related to the cues and how strongly the cues to traits and how perceivers utilize them in forming impressions. In other words, the good target provides more relevant cues in some of these domains, especially for extraversion and openness. The good judge is using these cues more efficiently, more strongly in all of the big five. We don't know yet about agreeableness and conscientiousness. We may have the wrong mediators, the wrong cues for this particular one. Okay. That's my argument, why the good judge and the good target may be basic, fundamental personality dimensions. As Funder is fond of saying, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, tastes like a duck, eventually you have to consider it might be a duck. And it certainly walks like a duck. How we perceive others, both accurately and with biases, these are strong individual differences. They're part of who we are. How we're perceived by others, again, is a fundamental individual difference and is part of who we are. These simple models that the field started off with are not sufficient. Complexity is needed in understanding others. This is real and it's needed in our models. Moderators do exist. We can predict some of the people better some of the time. There's people who are still arguing that moderators don't exist. I'm about to get into some disputes on that literature, but I think we can see that the building might be in trouble there. And to wrap up here, there are some broader implications, and to put it in a context, my quant side comes on here. We built a foundation on single assessments that presume a certain level of measurement, essentially tau equivalent, that biases, accuracy as well, is the constant and the same for everyone, and any bias is additive. We're seeing that life is indeed more complicated, and that model doesn't hold. We do need the more complicated measurement models for understanding personality, for understanding impressions. Formally, is a congeneric model that the slope, the relationship between the trait and the assessment that you have, that relationship can be different for each perceiver, for each target, for each dyad. And this may have profound implications for how we want to think about doing assessments of personality, how we develop and validate different dimensions of personality. There's a parallel to Cronbach here. The old way that we've done things may not be correct. I'm not going to go full Cronbach on the field yet, because it's not clear that we would end up with different answers, but the possibility exists that we might. And that is something we need to be concerned about and to move forward on. Thank you. We
have about 5 minutes. This is unfortunately before the class that comes in after my YouTube.
Yeah, Aaron.
So I think you've made a really compelling case of treating slopes as individual differences in their utility and for judges and targets. I'm curious if, like, one of your plans for this social accuracy model or your future research is to try to decompose where those slopes are defined. What I mean is, you can imagine someone who has a 0.5 slope for accuracy across a series of targets. So you might say that's a good judge. Or you could have 3 good judges, and one of them could be consistently an overestimator of someone's personality. One could be an underestimator, or one could be someone who overestimates on a single trait, like maybe 0.5 means they're accurate on 4 of the 5 traits, but inaccurate on openness.
Right.
0.5
Right.
could also mean they're inaccurate on extraversion and agreeableness, but accurate
Right.
on all the rest. So how,
This is one of the fundamental incompatibilities between these models. I skipped over those slides because I knew I was going to run out of time. That the social accuracy model, that's its limitation. It's Achilles' heel, its downfall, is that it can't provide you estimates of accuracy within a specific trait. You need to have variance on the predictor. So if you want to assess accuracy for something like extraversion, or some people more expressively accurate in the domain of extraversion, you're stuck. You can't, because you need to have variability across dimensions, across items. You need to have some variance on the validity measure to be able to do this type of assessment. You might be able to get away with doing facets and domains, and if there's enough variance there to start pulling that apart, and then you're talking about accuracy across these particular facets of a broader construct. But the narrower you get, you've lost that ability, that lens, the sensitivity, the ability to determine that, which is something I don't think we'll ever be able to get around. This is why there's a paradox. Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious about this personality dimension of being an open versus a closed book idea, and I'm just kind of curious to hear more about your thoughts of like why people are closed books, given that you said on one slide that being an open book is positively predictive of some good outcomes, right?
Yes.
Is it more that like there are just some people whose behavior is just simply much more variable in different kinds of contexts, or is it that they're actively trying to, they're motivated to hide certain aspects of their personality, and does it interact with the dimension you're looking at? Like maybe, extraversion in our culture, or like conscientiousness or openness are all considered kind of positive traits, right? So there are some dimensions of your personality that you might be more motivated to either be more open book about or closed book about? Right.
So we haven't been looking at individual assessments of aspects of personality. That's something we've been talking about. We do know that being an open book is related to positively to adjustment, to well-being, relationship well-being, lower depression. It's related to social anxiety. People who are socially anxious close off. They don't allow others to accurately form impressions, which could be a feedback loop, because we've also shown, Heumann has shown this, that people who are accurately perceived at initial encounters above and beyond positivity, that predicts the development of social ties across time. So there are positive consequences for being open that's above and beyond these other aspects. But it may be that within the samples we have, people are just not aware of this. We've experimentally manipulated this. We've had people, told them to self-present, to put their best face forward following Liz Dunn's type of manipulations than the work she's done, and that had a profound impact. People were more accurately seen when they engaged in self-presentation, not to be someone they're not, but to actively self-present, to put effort into the social interaction. And then people actually were more accurately seen. This is malleable, but people have predispositions across contexts to either open up or not. Yeah. Yes, Kristen.
I was thinking a little bit about the question of where this comes from also. So just kind of building on that, one of the things I was thinking was one of sort of my first thoughts was, well, maybe people are more open books when they just are at an extreme on various traits, right? Because it's just more obvious that you're neurotic if you're walking around with your nails in your mouth all the time.
Right.
And so your answer to Francis suggests that you think people can control this, at least in part, but I guess I'm wondering, do you think that there's a part that people can't control? That there's a part of being an open book that's not malleable, it's just an unchangeable part of you, in either direction?
Interestingly, we haven't found any real associations. We've asked people if they know. Mm-hmm. Do you know how accurately this person formed an impression of you? And it really doesn't come across. People, it's really, you're talking about extremity, is what you're asking. And that you could think of as falling back more towards Altport's cardinal traits. If there's some defining aspect about your personality and that part then is salient, that is something we probably need to do, is to start asking about some of those old moderators about importance and to get the variance within an individual to see if that predicts accuracy and how that's related, to start to tease apart some of those processes. But people are not aware of whether or not they're open books or not. That self-awareness is in our measures, and when we have a lot of data on this now, they're just clueless. It's somewhat similar to how they think how accurate their impressions are of others. There's a 50% of the variance, the main effect. Some people are like, yep, I'm for accurate impressions of others. And the answer is nope. That general predisposition is related to adjustment, cockiness, positive perspective is not accurate, it turns out. You have to separate that out, and then what's left over is predictive. But on the target side, people are not aware, which is weird. Or our sample may not have the life experience yet to have that self-reflective knowledge.
I don't think it's that weird, but I guess even if you don't know, it could be still driven by something that you're actively controlling, which you're suggesting it is, right? Like if you tell me to put a lot of effort in, I become more readable. So there's something that I'm actively doing, you know,
Right.
that's changing my readability. But I guess I was wondering if there's some things that I just can't really.
I'll put my social psych hat on at this point. It's people have behavioral scripts. Their modes, their general ways of interacting with the world, and for some of those it's closed down. For me, this makes a lot of sense. I've lived in a lot of different cultures across my life. New England, Costa Rica, Arizona. It's very different in all those cultures. And New England is, you just don't let people in. It's North Carolina is a little bit more open. Costa Rica, definitely. People are very open, but you have to learn how to read beyond the positivity because everyone's positive. And so that becomes a different skill. But there's behavioral scripts that people have, and those are hard to break out of. And people probably develop them as defensive mechanisms, perhaps. Yeah, Tony.
Just extending that, and you mentioned the work, I think it was from the Germans, using more of a dual process kind of
Yes.
approach. So would you say that people, do you think people are more revealing of who they are when they're on autopilot or when they're very deliberative? It sounds like when they're trying to put a it actually requires something more deliberative.
I don't know. Clearly. I have some intuitions, but I can't. I was trying to think if in our lab, there are studies that we do because we give people an unscripted situation. Sit down with someone, talk, and it's awkward. But we don't find any change in accuracy as people become familiar with the situation. We've been looking at the temporal effects. Because you're someone's first interaction, that's awkward, but people loosen up over time. And when you're in your 10th interaction, you've been doing this a while, people are loud, they're having fun, the room is really lively, and we have to pull people apart. No, now's the time for forming impressions, write them down. But we don't see any change in accuracy. And so I could see there's being kind of automatic versus deliberate change during that, but our analyses haven't shown any. There's a little bit of a positivity effect, the very first one. You form more positive impressions, then you get real. But, yeah.
All right, thanks so much.
Thanks.